Welcome to this recorded session called Writing for All Bodies, presented by the Cognition and Writing Standing Group for the 4Cs 2022 conference. Our focus today is on embodied cognition. This is a threshold concept that was presented in naming what we know. And we panelists feel like, even though it was presented then, not a lot of composition writing studies scholars know about it. And we also feel like they should, because as composition programs work to be more inclusive and supportive of all student writers of all bodies, embodied cognition is one possible way to do that. So this presentation will proceed with me, Laurie Miller from George Mason University, tracking embodied cognition, giving you background theories and concepts so that you have some context for the research you're going to hear about from the other panelists. The first panelist presenting research is Jackie Herman Elliott from Texas Women's University, and she'll talk about how she uses embodied cognition to help students develop writing practices, particularly invention and motivation. Then Allison Ellsworth from Arizona State University will speak about how she uses embodied cognition concepts to connect student writers, in this case engineers, to abstract language concepts. Then we'll conclude with a few thoughts. So embodied cognition, as we said, was really presented to the field most recently in 2016 in Bazerman and Tinsworth's essay called Writing is an Expression of Embodied Cognition that was published in that Naming What We Know book. And the real thrust of this essay is that writing comes from full engagement with the writer. It's not just a brain thinking. You've got to have a body going, moving the hand across the paper or typing on a keyboard. There's more involved than just a brain. But most composition scholars, maybe upon reading this, oh, that's interesting, I kind of agree with it, but they don't know the depth of the research and how it could apply to their own practices as writing scholars and practitioners. So we are going to give you a little bit of background. It all begins, well, not all, it goes back farther than this, but we'll take a look at Descartes, especially with the idea of the disembodied mind, that the mind and the body are separate and that the mind can do thinking on its own, doesn't need the body. And that pretty much dominated Western concepts of cognition until the 20th century, when we developed some new ideas and some new techniques for investigating cognition. And here is a chart of just some of the players in the development of cognitive science. And so you can see it's a multidisciplinary field. We have philosophy with people like Heidegger and Milieu-Ponty, and looking at cognition as being bound to context. We're moving a little bit out of just the brain. Now we've got context involved. In fields like education, although some people would say Dewey's also philosophy, but John Dewey's idea of knowledge is a result of active adaptation to one's environment, and the phrase learn by doing. So you've got to have that environment there. You just can't have the brain. Vygotsky in psychology, and the idea of the zone of proximal development and learning driven by social interaction. You've got to have that social interaction to really develop cognition. Piaget and his stages of cognitive development also brings in environmental factors, saying that there's a progressive development of cognition, and that is based on an interaction with the environment and actual biological structures maturing. The last two on this chart here, the computer science field and linguistics, kind of go back to the dualism model with Descartes. And because the early computing systems were based on mathematics and symbol manipulation, in these fields, we really get the idea that cognition is a manipulation of symbolic representations and that it is independent of the body. It takes place in the mind. And if you think about computers, right, that's really the idea. Like if computers are simulating cognition, they're definitely doing it not in a body. Um, an important part of this is that formal logic played a key role in the development of this. And so that is in no way involving anything but symbolic logic. Chomsky's early his initial theory in linguistic theory would be the universal grammar theory. Well, the big one that had impact, right? And this also is associated with that idea that that thinking doesn't come from somewhere else other than the mind. So what I mean by that is the universal grammar theory is that you're born with basic structures of language encoded in your brain at birth. So you don't have to interact with the environment. I mean, the basic structures are there. This is all going on. Chomsky's doing his work in the 60s there. And then you could see that there were beginnings of people thinking about it's more than just the brain. It's got to be an interaction with the body at least, and some with the environment. But sort of a watershed moment for embodied cognition is 1979, Lakoff and Johnson's book, Metaphors We Live By. Lakoff was a linguist and Johnson a philosopher. And Lakoff in particular was motivated to disprove Chomsky. He really felt like it wasn't a fair representation of cognition, that it's just the brain without as much influence from the environment and the body. So Mark Johnson had been working a lot on metaphors, and they got together and they came up with this theory that human cognition is founded on metaphors developed by interaction with the environment. And the book is just rich with information, but that is the key, that they're claiming human cognition is really metaphoric, and those metaphors are created by interacting with the environment. In 1991, I believe this is another important book. It's called The Embodied Mind. This was collaborative work between a cognitive scientist, a philosopher, and a psychologist. And they came up with this idea of inaction. And they define it as cognitive processes belonging to the relational domain of the living body coupled with its environment. So we're actually getting three things here then: cognition, the body, and the environment. And that's really what a lot of embodied cognition researchers will talk about now. So you can see here, Gallagher, 2011, cognition is the brain and the body and the environment. It's a dynamic system interacting, constantly changing. You can't have cognition without those three elements. Sullivan in 2018 noted that physical actions we perform, as well as the actions being performed around us, shape our mental experience. So that's kind of that Vygotsky thing, right? Where it's the social interaction. It's not just what we perform, but what others around us perform. And then Wilson, 2002, Wilson really talks about 6 types of embodied cognition, but I find this part very interesting. Where she notes, in some cognitive tasks, such as immediately temporal tasks, you've got it's right now in front of you, the mind operates to serve the needs of a body interacting in a real world situation. Like I need to know what's going on now. But in other cases, the body's interaction with the environment in a prior time serves the needs of the mind. So this would be more like memory, or if you're planning ahead or thinking back. So it doesn't have to be interaction immediately, but it could be another time and space. These three researchers, Fugate, Macron, and Cipriano, just a couple years ago, Note, knowledge is reenacted, in other words, simulated through the perceptual and sensory systems, the auditory, the visual, the motor, and the somatosensory, such that thinking about an action will invoke the same visual stimuli, motor movement, and tactile sensations that occur during the act itself. So it's just like you think about it, and the body is triggering those areas in the brain. And in some cases, you might even seem like you feel something or smell something. So that seems to be real evidence that it's all together. It's not just the brain is just not separate. And then I'll end with this. Although there are many individual views of embodied cognition, nearly all views ascribe to these two features. Cognition involves the body and its interaction with the world, and such interactions of the body with the world are represented in the brain in a non-abstracted sense. So it's key that we've got the body there. We've got the representation in the brain, but it's interacting with the world, right? It's the body, the world, the brain, and that it's manifested in this non-abstracted sense. It's not just symbolic manipulation here, that there's this dynamic interaction. So hopefully you've got a little bit better idea about what embodied cognition is. Here are some references I can offer up to give you some background information. And here is my contact information if you want to get in touch with me in any way. And we'll continue next with Jackie's presentation about her practices with embodied cognition.